All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our third hot topics in fire science and stewardship webinar. My name is Katie Lowe, and I am the statewide coordinator for UC ANR's Fire Network. I'm co-hosting the webinar today with Fire Advisor Allison Deek and Forest Advisor Jana Valikovic, and we're joined by our two speakers, Dr. Andrew Merschel and Dr. Chris Dunn. Before we get started, I just want to remind folks of a few basic Zoom rules. So during presentations, please keep yourselves muted, and you may ask our speakers questions during the Q&A period by typing it in the chat, and one of us will read it out loud. So with that, I will hand it over to Allison.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to introduce you all to Andrew Merschel. He's a ORISE fellow with the U.S. Forest Service at the Pacific Northwest Research Station. I had the great pleasure of being at the Association of Fire Ecology Congress, I want to say in December last year. I could be wrong about when that was. And I was able to see his talk, and I think it's really exciting research, just really challenging the way that we're thinking about fire regimes in in different places in Oregon, and challenging the way we've historically managed forests, and making us think a lot about how we can be doing it better to restore forested ecosystems there. I'll let him tell you more all about that, but I really want to invite everybody to think about how this research can challenge us to think differently about the fire regimes here in California as well. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks everybody for having me here today. Can you hear me okay and see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm Andrew. I'm a dendroecologist. I use tree rings to help us better understand how forests developed historically, and a lot of the work right now is focused on how fire influenced forest development over time. So this work has sort of taken me from dry ponderosa pine forest over the Cascades into the western hemlock zone, where we have these very super productive rainforests or temperate rainforests that are also seasonally dry. So today's presentation is going to be a really quick summary of new tree ring fire histories that are in these super productive temperate rainforests. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of background. On the left, I'm showing you a map of fire regimes for the Northwest Forest Plan area that was put together in 2018. You can see that these broadly transition from the very frequent mixed severity fire regime with 5 to 25 year intervals to infrequent stand replacing with greater than 200-year intervals, and sort of longer stand replacing fire regime types being further north in the region and also in the Oregon Coast Range. And so what we're saying here is that we expect in that blue and black zone for most of our fire return intervals to be more than 50 years and often greater than 200 years in this area. What I want to point out about this map is that it's really just a map of temperature, precipitation, and lightning groups. This isn't a map that's been fed or informed by actual records of historical fires or their frequency and variability over time. So our goal here is to add some hard data from the past to this map. Another interesting piece about this map is it's basically making the hypothesis that temperature, precipitation, and lightning are the primary drivers of what the fire regime is in the Pacific Northwest. And we sort of just need to understand those things to model fire regimes. So that's leaving out a couple different things which I'll touch on today. The first being that young stands in the Douglas fir zone are more flammable than older stands. And that the region had a history of traditional burning or cultural burning by Indigenous peoples that's not incorporated into this model. So here's our study area subject, these super productive Douglas fir western hemlock forests. And right now I'm going to show you sort of the paradigm or general model for how these develop over time in that infrequent stand replacing regime. So this diagram here is basically showing year zero, there's a stand replacing fire, kills almost all of the mature and old trees in the stand. After that, you get a cohort of Douglas fir on the site. It's a pretty dense cohort, and as the trees in that cohort start competing with each other, individual members start to drop out and create gaps and canopy holes in the stand. And this really accelerates in sort of the mature forest stage, where we start to get larger canopy gaps that allow species like western hemlock to come into the understory to increase species diversity and to start develop the multi-layered canopy that we expect in an old growth stage in these forests. Some other important characteristics you see as the forest gets older are the snags and logs. So we're looking for multi-layered canopies, mixed species composition, snags and logs, and sort of these gaps and openings in the old growth stage. What this graph sort of implies is that all of this old growth development happens in the absence of fire and not with fire. It also implies a very linear process in which it sort of goes in one way and comes to an endpoint. But there's another model for the region that's gaining more and more recognition as we look at the pattern of historical fires in these forests. And just briefly, this is saying that there's probably several different development types that occur based on variability in both the frequency of fire and its severity over time. And I would also argue that the timing of fires within stand development really matters in how they develop over a long time period. What I'm showing you here is a summary or a model from Alan Tepley's work in the Central Oregon Cascades. And what he did is he collected tree cores to age stands and trees in those stands. And he hypothesized after looking at those stand development histories that most of the forest he was working in was actually tended by non-stand replacing fire, and that was important to develop different types of old growth in his study area. What's been missing from our knowledge of the fire regime is fire scars on trees that tell us the exact year of fires, their frequency, and really allow us to definitively say that fire is a process that's shaping the development of old forests. So in the work that I'm a part of, we've been taking a regional approach to developing fire histories across the Western Cascades. This is sort of a not quite up to date, but almost up to date map of where we've put fire histories in the past 4 or 5 years in these temperate rainforests. So each one of those icons on the map of the left is a fire history site. What we do at the sites is pretty simple. We find an old clear cut. We go up to the old stumps and we remove cross sections off of those stumps to get cambial fire scars, which tell us the exact year that a fire occurred historically. I just want to mention that all of our fire records are cross-dated. What that means is we know the year of formation of each ring, and from that we can know the exact year of each fire. So I want to point out that this is a really new frontier for fire history in North America. The graph here right now is showing you precipitation on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. And the background shading is climate space in the Western US. The small triangles are previously published fire histories, and the large triangles are fire histories from our new fire history work in the Western Cascades. And very briefly, what I want you guys to see is that we're working in forests that are much wetter than forests where fire histories have been done before. So when this is why we're probably seeing results that really challenge perceptions of how frequent fire was in the Pacific Northwest. So now I'm going to jump right into some preliminary findings from the fire records that we've developed at these sites. The first one being that our historical fire intervals were non-stationary. Another way to say that is that they weren't, there was no mean fire interval. If you looked at one century, it might have frequent fire, and the next century might have very infrequent fire. So we have non-stationary fire frequency. And so here's an example of that. This is a sort of a typical site in the moist Western Hemlock Zone in the Western Cascades. This site's at about 3,800 feet of elevation, and it has that classic multi-layered, mixed species, multi-age class stand structure that we expect in a stand that's about 500 years old. And now I'm going to show you the record of how this stand developed over time with fire. So on this graph, every tree that we've sampled gets its own timeline. So this bottom timeline corresponds to a tree that established in about 1560, and then its outer rings went to about the year 1900. Every triangle on this graph represents a cambial fire scar. So the story at this site is probably that there was a high severity fire right around 1564. After that high severity fire, there was the establishment of a Douglas fir cohort. And then what you can see happening next is that during the first century of development for this forest, there was 3 additional reburns. And so that's a really important property of the system. We often see more frequent fire in the first 100 years of forest development, and this stand had 3 reburns in its first century. You can also see that there's an additional cohort associated with the fires in 1615 and 1621 at this site. So a really interesting part is after that first century of development, we see the stand doesn't have fire for well over a century, and that's that non-stationary fire return interval that I was referring to. So lots of fire when they're young, then it could go centuries without a fire and then experience fire again. So a very variable pattern of fire over time. Here's some summary statistics for mean and median fire frequency. I really don't like reporting these because the stories in the Western Cascades are really broad. There's a ton of variability. We have sites that burned 5 or 6 times per century and sites that didn't burn for centuries. But I do want to show you guys that across all of these sites, the most common mean fire interval is quite low. So it's less than 50 years at a lot of these sites, and we've been sort of hypothesizing that they generally go well over 50 years to several centuries without fire. The other point I want to point out is that many of the sites have at least a couple examples of very short fire return intervals. So they may have a few very long ones, but they also have some very short ones at these sites. So this sort of loads up a next main finding. Reburns are common in these forests. So after a high severity fire, this graph is just showing you the percent of sites that reburned during their first century of development. I wouldn't say it's the rule, but most of our sites burn within their first 50 years of establishment. So that early development history, that early seral phase is going to be extended, and the stand's going to be shaped by these reburns. In addition to the tree ring data, we also have several of examples of this in the region from more recent fires. So the Tillamook fire and the Occult fire, these were big high severity events like the 2020 fires were. And in the decades after those events, there were several reburns within those initial stand replacing patches. So why is this reburn property happening in this forest? We think it's because early seral forests in the Douglas fir region are more flammable. And they're going to burn under a broader range of fire weather conditions. So if you've ever been in a clear cut or in a high severity fire on a steep slope in the afternoon, you know that the temperatures are much higher, the humidity is much lower, the wind speeds are higher, and then you're also going to be full of these early successional fuels, which are more flammable and dry out more quickly. And then after stand replacing fire, you're also going to have the fuels coming down from that fire. So it sort of sets up this relatively flammable environment in comparison to the mature or old forest that burned down. And we think that's why we see these reburns in the Douglas fir western hemlock zone. The next point I want to make is that most historical fires that we've reconstructed were not high severity fires, and we found little evidence of regional fire synchronicity. And another way to say that is we're not finding a ton of evidence that the west side of the Cascades used to burn up all at once. We're finding lots of evidence of small fires being a really important part of the fire regime. So here's a really simple graph that shows that. This is of 60 sites, this is the number of sites that burned in each year. You can see that there are some years where 3 or 4 sites burned in the same year. But in general, we have a lot of years where only 1 site burned. This is very different from the dry forest zone, ponderosa pine forest, dry mixed conifer forest. If you did the same study there, you would have years where 25 to 50% of your sites burned in 1 year. So we see actually less evidence of extensive fires and a lot of evidence for these sort of smaller mixed severity fires happening in this system that didn't happen across the region all at once. Caveat to that is we're not saying that the big east wind fires that happen during severe weather do not happen in the region. We have lots of evidence of them in other historical records. And we, of course, have evidence of them in the recent 2020 wildfires that are shown on this map. I think what's going on is that we've sampled so coarsely We haven't picked up some of these past east wind events, and you'd have to sort of sample at a finer scale to sort of reconstruct these events historically. Another really interesting component of this fire history and the regime is that we're not finding strong fire-climate relationships. That relates back to the lack of synchronicity that we're seeing across the region. And I think that points to other properties or drivers of the fire regime being important, including indigenous fire stewardship, the age of the stand, is it young versus mature, and then extreme weather events, which aren't really climate. So you can have an east wind event outside of a severe drought and still have a really big fire in the region. So just a quick graphical summary of that. This is an SEA analysis that basically looks at the relationship between fire occurrence and climate. And you're paying attention to the year 0 here, which is the fire year. And what you're looking for is a significant negative drought departure in the fire year. And we're not seeing it. And that's really, really interesting because you'd expect in a moist forest for fire historically to be limited to hot, dry conditions and drought. But we're actually seeing that a lot of the fires burned outside of these severe conditions historically. So I think that again links to these other drivers: indigenous fire stewardship, adding fire to the system outside of extreme conditions, and then this property for young stands to burn outside of hot, dry conditions. So I want to finish up with this point. There's not a lot of time to present this subject, and I think it deserves its own presentation. But we didn't intentionally locate sites that were known sites of cultural burning or indigenous fire stewardship, but we found several sites with very high frequency of fire in the moist forest zone that is indicative of cultural burning. These are places without a lot of lightning, but frequent fire. And so I think this has been a major part or driver of the fire regime that's been left out of our sort of Western models and thinking about fire in these forests in the region. I want to finish up back with my picture that I had at the very start of the talk. Sorry for going back here. I'm just going to let that sit here for a second. So here we have our old growth forest. It's taken 500 years to develop. You can see that char on the 500-year-old tree in the foreground. What happened at this site is it had 2 fires in the late 1800s. They killed a lot of Douglas fir, and they provided the opportunity for the silver fir, Western hemlock, and Douglas fir that are in that younger age class in the frame to come into the stand. And now it has this classic multi-layered structure, mixed species composition, lots of snags and logs that we expect in an old growth forest. And one major sort of takeaway for me in this work is that the majority of old forests in the region actually were shaped by fire as they developed. So it's not really that old growth conditions develop in the absence of fire. It's really fire and time that develops old growth in the region. So I wouldn't say it's exclusively that way, but most of our sites are old growth that developed with fire. So I think that's done there, and I'll cut it off and let Chris go next.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's perfect segue onto Chris's talk. And I think for those listening in the audience, you'll get why Katie and I were so excited to bring these speakers from Oregon. Because I think both Allison and I have lived in Oregon. So we've lived both in California and Oregon, and you live in a place in Oregon that has just a different mindset around the relationship with fire. At least that's how it's been through time. And it's really formed and shaped, I think, our values and our viewpoints around how old growth develops. And, you know, are these forests kind of fireproof in essence? And I think it's created some blinders in how we've thought about ecosystem management and our own sense of safety and security. So I wanted to bring Chris Dunn into the conversation because in translating that sort of evolving framework around fire and forests and ecosystems in general, it's kind of put the policy space front and center around how do we protect our communities, how do we protect our values, and how do we live in these landscapes with more resiliency and more adaptation. And so Chris has been a part of a conversation and a policy development, much like the stuff we're working with in California. And so I'd love to learn more about what Oregon's doing and how you're interfacing kind of these these complicated issues around wildfire and people's perception of risk within that. So I'll turn it over to you, Chris. And Chris is with Oregon State University, and he's an assistant professor and a great asset to California. You come down a lot to give us some assistance. So thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thanks, Yana. I appreciate that. You're far too kind, but I'll do my best. Got the slideshow? You can hear me all right? I'm on the road, so I'm working out of a coffee shop, so apologize for any undue noise in the background. So I'm going to give you a little talk about some policy, I'd say some policy challenges we had here in Oregon recently and are still dealing with today, having public meetings as soon as next Monday again. So I titled it as Oregon's Wildfire Risk / Hazard Mapping Experience Debacle. Really what it is Oregon's wildfire hazard debacle, and I'll explain why we think about it this way as I go through this presentation. But for those of you that didn't really hear what was going on up here, I'm going to give you some headlines that came out after the release of a wildfire risk map, and I'll explain what we were trying to accomplish there. We now refer to it as hazard map, which is more correct terminology for it, but you can see with the AP here that this emerges as a new climate flashpoint from GRIST. We tried to inform residents about their wildfire risk, and the backlash was certainly explosive. And ultimately, we see that swamped by this public outcry that came from trying to essentially help protect communities was so controversial that the state eventually retracted it and has been spending the last year and a half to 2 years trying to implement this at this point now. So just to give you a sense of how we got here, this is a picture of Governor Brown, and this Senate Bill 762 in 2021 was one of her signature legislation from her tenure as Oregon governor. And you can see here, this is just an image of her signing it. And this was a real, this was really progressive legislation, especially for Oregon, and really focused on adapting 11 different state agencies to be more responsive to the changing fire environment. And that's a pretty big lift, and it did a lot. I'm going to focus on my role, Oregon State University's role in this process. But just know that there was a lot that was accomplished through the legislation that has been less controversial and really beneficial to the state overall. So this is, the list on the right was what we were really mandated to do as Oregon State University in partnership with Oregon Department of Forestry. And that's to develop a wildland urban interface map. So to actually map that and create the official WUI map for Oregon, at least in reference to this policy map that they called wildfire risk at the time. It really is a wildfire hazard map. And then also map social vulnerability so that we ensure that the allocation of resources are more equitable than they have been in the past. And then put this on a public web interface so that the public can engage with the map, look up their address, look up their hazard rating, and get more information about that. And then there's a timeline that you see here. And I had the image of Governor Brown signing the legislation, and that came towards the end of her tenure after the 2020 wildfires that we experienced, much like California and Washington did. But it really all built out of a council that Governor Brown had set up back in 2019, and we spent about a year with. There was probably 75 individuals involved in that. I was the science advisor with others, and they put forth recommendations of how to move the state forward and adapt to the changing wildfire environment. It was put into a short session early 2020, but it failed mostly because half of our legislators fled the state, and therefore there wasn't quorum, and we couldn't push any legislation through at that time. But subsequently, and probably beneficially to this, we had the 2020 wildfires, beneficial to policy. I'm not saying it's beneficial to anything else. But we had the 2020 wildfires, which really gives that opens that window for change and policy change that's common within that first year of these natural hazards or otherwise. And so the 2020 wildfires happened in September, and by the time we were in the legislative session in 2021, they were successful in passing Senate Bill 762, which laid the foundation for all that adaptation of those 11 state agencies. And with that we had this 1 year timeline to do all the things you see on the right there. which is a heavy lift. And we were basically told with our industry collaborators, industry being fire modeling industry and others, that we couldn't accomplish this, but we were lucky enough to cajole them and know them well enough that we did accomplish this, despite the heavy lift. As this came on, the first thing that I did, being responsible for development of all these maps, was to bring together a science team from Oregon State University. You can see this list here, working with civil engineers and Dr. Erica Fisher in particular, because we are talking about the built environment, which really is a civil engineering challenge. The wildfire might be a natural resource challenge, and really trying to bring forth that sort of co-production, co-knowledge that is so necessary to address these issues with our community resilience. And then Dr. Crandall as well, who's a rural economic and development professor here at Oregon State University, to round out the social vulnerability piece, with a couple other scientists that you see here, Andy McAvoy and Caitlin Riley. And we were the science team that was present with Oregon Department of Forestry to work through this process together. What that process really looked like is what you see here on this timeline, particularly keying into that 1 year time frame we had, and then what you see on the right. And most of this was occupied by developing the wildfire analytics. So we were doing that simultaneously while developing the rules around the policy about how we would map the wildland urban interface, map wildfire hazard, and ultimately integrate those two, and then overlay the social vulnerability piece. And so we had sort of those two processes happening simultaneously. It amounted to about 70 hours of public debate with this rules advisory committee of 26 member, dominantly lawyers and lobbyists from various industries, trying to sort of manipulate and get a map that is more preferential to their desires. And I would view that the scientists, we were there to try to maintain some level of objectivity and keep it within the realm of what we could produce as scientists within this space. And so after about that 70 hours of public debate, it then went to our board of forestry and worked through the general policy process in that way. And then we did and successfully, success maybe is an overstatement, but we did deliver the map on the timeline that was requested of us and mandated us within the legislation, which was June 30th, 2022, and we released that. And ultimately, the map, I think, lasted about 5 weeks in the public sphere. In development of the wildfire hazard portion of this map, we really relied on I guess, the best available science and processes today. And you'll see this coming out of Pyrologics. California has these estimates. We see national estimates coming out of Pyrologics, working with U.S. Forest Service and other agencies, CAL FIRE, ODF, and so forth. And we integrate basically burn probability and fire intensity as a real look at, if a home was present at this location, should they implement some home hardening standards in defensible space. And so the map really is looking at the landscape as if we were going to put a structure there, and should they do some mitigation actions given the fire hazards that are present. We don't address the susceptibility piece. The legislation didn't allow us to, nor do we have the data to really look at all structures and say, what is their vulnerability or susceptibility based on whether or not they have implemented some home hardening standards or defensible space. So we're really in the fire hazard piece, which is the top two, the burn probability and fire intensity. Round out the risk, we'd want to include the susceptibility, but we aren't there yet in Oregon, and certainly I don't think anywhere in the United States today do we have that level of detail and data to really inform that process. This is what the outcomes look like. On the left is that burn probability component for the state of Oregon, and of course our coast range, very moist forest, has lower probability. Southwest Oregon is much like Northern California, Klamath Mountains ecoregion, where there's a significant fire load every year through lightning, as well as human ignitions. And then on the right side, we see the resulting fire intensity map that came out of these analytics developed for the broader state. And we can get into details of that if anybody has any questions, but I'm just going to breeze through and say, we're using some of the most advanced modeling techniques that we have today to make these assessments. And we incorporate quite a bit of variability that comes within the wildfire environment to do that. And ultimately, we landed on this map. That the original risk criteria were for 5 classes that you see listed here, from no all the way to extreme risk. Those were mandated in the legislation. And so we produced this map as seen, even though really what we're targeting is that higher, greater hazard as areas where they're going to be subject to defensible space and home hardening regulations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's really, you have to be at high hazard, and you also have to be within the wildland urban interface to be subject to these downstream regulations and to be preferentially targeted for mitigation actions and funding that came with the legislation, including $20 million to support those that are socially vulnerable in their efforts to implement these defensible space and home hardening standards. Home hardening was not retroactive. It's only for new construction or significant remodels, but defensible space was retroactive in the sense that if you are in high hazard, you will have to implement defensible space if you don't already have those. As far as the wildland urban interface, it's pretty much a standard process here. You can see the flow chart and how it flows. I'm not going to go step by step just for time's sake, and you can watch the video or you can have these slides thereafter. I think the key point here is that we used a density threshold of 1 per 40 acres. I believe California uses 1 per 20 acres, but then adds a 1.5 mile buffer outside of that to identify the wildland urban interface. We're just looking at 1 per 40 acres, and we don't add that buffer. We're really focused on the built environment here. And then it has to either be embedded within the vegetation at 50% cover, otherwise to be an intermixed community, or within that 1.5 mile proximity to large areas of combustible vegetation to be that interface community. And ultimately, we see a map reduced to look what you see on the right. And this really is the regulatory map as we see it for the state of Oregon. The gray area is being excluded from that. And we're targeting the red and orange in this case as those areas that are subject to that downstream regulation, which will be implemented by another agency, the Oregon State Fire Marshal, as well as the Building Codes Division that is mandated, that really operates at the state level. And so this is ultimately what was the risk map or our hazard map going forward. And that amounted to, as you can see here with the numbers, 4.4% of the land base within Oregon was found to be within the wildland urban interface, and 23% of that by area landed within high, or in this case, higher extreme hazard, amounted to 120,000 tax lots within that upper class out of the 1.8 million that we have. Now it's fairly low because the majority of our populace resides in the Willamette Valley, which is in the northwestern section of Oregon, where there's a lot more moisture and a lot lower hazard, at least currently. And our east side and our southwest side are much more prone to wildfire. That 120,000 tax lots is roughly 8.8% of Oregon tax lots. And then we estimated that currently about 80,000 of those have an existing structure on those, and therefore would have to implement those defensible space standards retroactively if they don't already have them. Many of them actually do. Now, we of course, as I mentioned, this map was pulled because of the public controversy. And this really brings up this idea that communication and outreach becomes the central need when these types of activities are pursued and these types of policies are pursued forward. This is just an image, and I've circled some areas, and I know it's hard to read, so I'll let you know, but this came out actually in October during that first year where we're trying to develop these tools by an organization that's a rural property rights organization. This individual was a member of the Rules Advisory Committee and started putting out information that you see here that really was sowing some doubt in what the state was trying to do. And there was no concerted effort to inform the residents at the time of what was trying to be accomplished through this legislation. So this was starting to fill those spaces in people's brains about what's coming down the line without any other alternative information. And it sowed a lot of fear, particularly in our rural communities, about what the state is trying to accomplish. And you can see in the upper left, they're saying you're going to have to remove crops if you have those on your land. You're going to have to remove managed timber. So, we have a thriving timber industry, and they're in fear of regulation and loss of revenue from their lands. And you may have to remove your rose bushes and your oak tree in your front lawn. And this actually was amplified by the governor's race that was happening at the time, and they were bringing up these same salient points to the public and further sort of fomenting these what are not true statements. You can see a rural property there that they're claiming will be identified as urban. Not true. Those properties are generally excluded. And then there's discussions and fear of having to spend $100,000 to retrofit your house, which is not true. As I noted, you don't have to retrofit your house if it already exists. It's only under new construction, and those estimates of that cost is much more marginal. You know, Headwaters Economics maybe says $6,000 to $8,000 of additional cost from the lowest value. Our building codes say it's about a 10% increase, which can be substantial, but isn't anywhere near $100,000 when building a home. We hear, you know, this narrative really drove a lot of the public backlash in that somebody in one of our meetings that was canceled because we received death threats and we couldn't show up in person anymore because the state police canceled the meeting and said you have to go to Zoom. This narrative sort of popped out of that when somebody said my insurance dropped me after the map was released within 2 days, which is really, you know, an impossible timeline for that type of activity to occur. And you know, as the owner of the data, I can tell you that no insurance companies have it or had access to it to integrate into their models. But this idea that the insurance rates were going to skyrocket as a result of our assessment became the dominant narrative that really drove the public backlash, despite it being untrue. And then it was investigated by our financial regulation organizations and found to be an untruth. And yet even the media was amplifying that throughout the time. But it wasn't the only thing that was being amplified by the media or by the politicians. They all took advantage of this situation. And you can see here that as drafted, these maps don't seriously address the problem, which is we're not managing our forest correctly. This is an old narrative that fires are only in the forest, fires are driven by the forest, and that the lack of intensive forest management drives to the loss of our communities. And that we, you know, and therefore, you know, it should be out in the forest only, not within our grasslands and shrublands, where we actually have observed the majority of our losses. And you can see a fire across the bottom here, which was the Alameda Drive fire that manifests within that 2020 wildfire event. Started within the community of Ashland and burned into 2 other communities through primarily grasslands and a riparian corridor, which was full of invasive blackberries. And it really drove it to a loss of 2,400 homes within the 12-hour period.
Chris, I think that's a perfect place maybe to kind of wrap it here so that we can take a question or two. No, it's, I mean, I think the story is fascinating, and I can only imagine how many sleepless nights you've had in shepherding and trying to navigate through these complicated issues and narratives, and, you know, how do we interface science to public understanding and communication and figure out how to right-size policy. And, you know, my hat's really goes off to you all to try and tackle both defensible space and home hardening in one fell swoop, which is, you know, something that we've been working on in California for much longer time period. And so it's at least the terms are a little more common here. It doesn't mean that it's any easier to work through. But I think the pairing here of Andrew's, you know, framing around fire return intervals, the frequency of fire, and how it's shaped our landscapes, and kind of our misperceptions, in part because our sampling maybe doesn't always collect the level of detail that we need to be able to inform the thinking is kind of a key component to how we see ourselves in these fire issues. So I'll wrap my summary here and turn it over to anyone who'd like to ask a question. I know we go till about 12:45, so I'm sure we can stay on a couple more minutes for those who'd like to hang on, and let people go for those who feel like it's time to transition back to their workday. So are there any questions out there? Maybe I'll start with one while we're getting going. Andrew, what do you think are the key lessons for California from your work? Do you see any parallels to kind of our coastal forest environments? What would you say in relation to what you've been
Sure.
talking?
I've been using sort of a term that I got from the redwood forest. There's a paper called instead of rainforests, call them fire forests, and it came out of the redwoods. Very similar story unfolded there a bit earlier than it did in Oregon, where the sort of narrative for those coastal foggy forests was that they rarely burned. And then there was another group of scientists saying, actually, they had a lot of fire, and a lot of that was cultural burning in the redwoods. And we seem to actually be following sort of in the footsteps of that work and saying our coastal forest in Oregon also had a lot of frequent fire historically. So I think an important part here is to remember that there's more drivers of fire than just drought and lightning ignitions. And that if you intentionally use fire, you can use it under a much broader range of conditions. And another important lesson is maybe that fire in these moist forests is a self-reinforcing process, such that when you burn or have an early sterile condition, you're allowing fire to operate more in that system. So it's kind of different from our dry forests that are fuel limited, where you can sort of burn or treat fuels and really limit fire in that system. It doesn't really work the same way on the west side. They're really productive systems that also can burn frequently.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll flip that to you, Chris. Do you have any sense of key lessons that maybe we can learn from you all that that are informed by your work? And I know your work is more dimensional than just this policy stuff, but can you bring us any thoughts or suggestions?
There's a lot of pop-up questions coming in from the chat, but I think two things I'll say is that the public perception of risk really is seemingly driven by their local environment. And so, which is good, but that's really a vulnerability sort of perspective. And that's different than the hazard that's presented by the environment that they live in. And that sort of biases people's perceptions and understanding of what they might need to do. Like, oh, I water my lawn, therefore I'm at low risk. And that we know is not necessarily the case. And so we need more communication and continued education to reinforce the full fire picture coming from our wildlands or our adjacent private lands and the exposure that is to our personal selves and our personal property. To that, gosh, there's so much. I'll stop there. I think it's that communication rollout, like continuing to work with the public and really recognizing that policymakers may not understand this. Scientists don't understand what's going on in the public and policy sphere, and the public may not understand what's going on. And how you integrate across all three of those is the key to success and an extreme challenge. And I don't really have an answer as to what works best there, only that it is imperative that we start to get that right. And the public's not there with us yet. Our policymakers aren't there with the detail that they need. And so the work that you do through UCCE and otherwise is paramount, and it's so important.
Yeah, terrific. Well, we got inspired from both your talks at the science conference we went to and thought it would be a good idea to try and make them more available and accessible to our California and extended audiences. We're thinking maybe in the background, we've got two kind of polling questions for the participants. Maybe we'll launch those and then we'll take the two chat questions so that we can keep the dialogue going for those who want to stay and let those who want to go. So if you just give us a thought about what you found interesting from this webinar, that'd be awesome, just so we know what kind of material you're interested in and kind of can better frame information for our future webinars. That'd be terrific. And maybe we'll keep chatting for a minute while that's up. And then maybe we'll move to this first question here from Mark. And I think you started to hit at it about the need to improve outreach and in public and private interests. What do you think would have helped?
Oh boy. I mean, we could have used anything. It's like the state did nothing. And so there was no narrative out there even explaining what the legislation was. It was done and they assumed that it reached the public. And that is a really poor assumption. We need to be out and in the field and working directly with people. That's the only thing that works. I was talking with a student of mine this morning who works out in Northeastern Oregon, and some of his colleagues within the Forest Service came up to him and said, hey, did you hear that, fire suppression has increased fuel loadings in our forests? And this is like a very old narrative and something that I think all of us probably on this call have thought about and certainly heard of. But these are practitioners in the Forest Service that still aren't accepting that until they hear it from somebody they trust, I believe. And then they're sort of blown away like, wow, fire suppression has consequences. That is suggesting that we are not reaching everybody that needs to be reached, and particularly those that are more, I guess, adverse to change and adverse to policy changes. And we saw that when we got the biggest backlash when letters went into people's mailboxes and told them what was coming, which is a scary way to receive this information from the state. They are not in the same information pipelines, and they are not hearing what many of the rest of us are saying, or what science is producing, or otherwise, and finding avenues to get into those information ecosystems is paramount to reaching those that are most resistant to change.
That's a great reminder, Chris. There was one additional follow-up question. As you know, insurance is a big issue down here in California. And we had a question about how the insurance situation has evolved in Oregon since the maps were withdrawn. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I can do my best. I'm not an insurance person, but you know, I think we had an overall 15% on average increase in insurance rates, but that really has been couched as Oregon's been under sort of, I guess, the premiums in Oregon have already been low, and they were artificially low. And so some of that is just market correction. And then the others is mostly been attributed to general inflation, not so much fire. However, I was working down at the California border in the community of Ashland, and some insurance companies have either dropped or dramatically increased premiums for individuals that are in close proximity to the forested watersheds adjacent to these communities. And they were marked increases, but they just are seemingly drawing like arbitrary lines at roads and saying everything above this road gets this massive increase and then the rest doesn't. They're not, the insurance companies' modelings are not very refined to date, and they're trying to improve that, and they're investing in companies, particularly in the tech industry in California, to help them actually model more akin to like what we do, and better refine the distribution of their premiums. But they're not there yet. So we've had some marginal change, but it hasn't been significant. And some additional legislation came on to incentivize our insurance industry, our insurance market to be more competitive, more transparent to the public. So they have to deliver more information when premiums change. And then they still are responsible for justifying why they can change premiums to our Department of Financial Regulation. So we're not hit that hard yet. Some individuals, except for some very specific and small locations, usually mostly around Southwest Oregon. Unlike, say, Oklahoma, which had double, the insurance rates, and it turns out that Oklahoma is actually worse off than, I mean, not as a dollar whole, but they had the largest increases in premiums across the state, across the United States, followed by Kansas and then Texas and California. So it's not a, us or them or a blue state issue. It's a hazard, a natural hazard issue, and those hit many places.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. I think it often gets left out of the conversation. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Can everybody please give a big round of applause for our two wonderful presenters and for sharing their time with us during this lunch hour. I'm sure we could all spend the rest of the afternoon asking you both questions. So, but we want to respect everybody's time. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing everybody at the next webinar that we do, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Everybody for joining us. As Allison mentioned, we do have one more webinar left in the series. It's going to be on Wednesday, July 17th from 12 to 12:45 p.m. Pacific. So more information can be found on the Fire Network website, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.